and in them will live the hopes of a unified humanity. Theirs will be the strength to prevail, not only when victory lies within easy reach, but even when it seems unattainable. When doom settles like a shroud all about, in those times of darkness, my noble sons will shine the brightest of all.
Words spoken by the master of mankind himself regarding his sons, his weapons, his tools, his Primarchs. It could be said that in all of humanity's history, no scientific undertaking has been as ambitious nor as grand in scale as the Primarch project. The Emperor of Mankind's labor to create 20 genetically engineered transhuman demigods. Not that he would ever refer to them with such religious overtones. The Emperor's dream for an everlasting human empire that dominated the galaxy would require generals of superlative ability. They could not just be human, they needed to be more, to be almost the equals of the Emperor himself. Knowledge was required, more than could be learned from the teachings of man. The Emperor traveled beyond old Earth during the age of technology to the world of Molech. Upon that world was a place where order and chaos could be traversed, an aperture into the warp, and to a place where gods held court. None know of what transpired between the Emperor and the gods of chaos, nor how long such a meeting took. It is possible that eternities passed within the Immaterium, that the master of mankind was made to endure, overcome, resist, and subvert the machinations of the gods. Whatever happened, when he finally returned to Moloch from out of the warp, a bargain had been struck, and the Emperor had been gifted both knowledge and power. It would not be until the later years of the Unification Wars that the Emperor would begin his master plan. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountain range, within his secret laboratorium, the Emperor gathered to him the greatest minds in genetic manipulation and crafting. Individuals such as Astramilitarum and the perpetual Urda would aid in the Primarch's conception and development, with the latter of the two submitting her own genetic material. This to be spliced with the Emperor's own. Yes, my friends. If the master of mankind was the Primarch's father, then Urda would be their mother. As an aside, Astramilitarum would post-Primarch project become instrumental in the development of the Legiones Astartes, her name forever etched upon their legacy. Not only did the Emperor invest the greatest scientific minds to the task, but it is suspected that arcane and mystic arts were also employed. Rumor abounds that the power of the warp was woven throughout the Primarchs' genetics. Such an entwining of science and sorcery would culminate in beings of unmatched power and charisma. They would be the greatest leaders, warriors, tacticians, craftsmen, and visionaries humanity would ever know, save for their creator, of course. Whilst identical at the fundamental level, each Primarch would develop and display unique talents and traits due to the manipulation of their DNA. Lehman Russ, Primarch of the Vilka Fenrica, known as the Space Wolves to the wider Imperium, showed clear signs of lupine DNA introduced to his genetic code. This would no doubt be the contributing factor in both Russ and his son's fearsome aspect in war, as well as their acute sensory perception and bestial characteristics. It also would explain the rumor of a curse that lingers over the sons of Russ. But that is a tale best left for another time. In the case of Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, he would exhibit an exceptional proficiency in the psychic arts. Such was his affinity that his power was only bettered by that of his father. Indeed, before Magnus would ever stand before his lord and master in body, they had already communed telepathically across the vast gulfs of space. Unlike Russ, though, Magnus' abilities cannot be assigned to the splicing of non-human DNA. It is possible that Magnus' psychic talents find their origin in more arcane techniques of gene editing. For the Primarchs are as much beings of the immaterial as they are of the material. Besides these examples, it would be prudent to note each of the Emperor's sons had abilities that extended into the warp. As sons of the Emperor of mankind, their Primarchs were all psychically sensitive to a degree, whether overtly, such as Magnus, or more subtle, like Rogel Dawn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, ability to not only resist the warp, but to weaken demons in his presence. In this instance, Dawn had no active means of controlling this trait. It simply exuded from him as naturally as breathing. When viewed individually, the Primarchs are as exceptional as they are unique, sublime in every conceivable way, all but perfect by any metric. When viewed as a brotherhood of 18, then a mortal mind's ability to fathom the scale of power personified loses any rational means of measurement. 18 gods amongst men, capable of feats unmatched by any other being in existence, able to break armies single-handedly, silence raving demagogues with a stare, forge mechanisms of unsurpassed sophistication and beauty, and bring worlds to compliance through sheer charisma alone. 18 suns to conquer the galaxy and reunite all of humanity under one banner. the Imperiumofman. But before the Emperor would get his chance to tutor and mold his sons into the generals, scholars, and leaders he needed, disaster would strike. Allow me a moment, traveler, to gather my thoughts. It can be argued when the Emperor's dream failed. You may very well have an opinion already, but for myself, what transpired beneath the old Himalayan mountains was the moment mankind was damned. All that is known is each Primarch re-emerged above different planets spread across the galaxy, and down they plummeted through fire and cloud until crash landing on the surfaces of their new homes. Such spectacular and calamitous descents were often viewed by the world's native populations, and search parties would quickly set out to investigate the strangeness assailing their world. These Primarchs, discovered soon after landing, would be adopted and raised within the culture they found themselves in. Rabute Gilliman was a prime example. Taken in and raised by a nobleman of a relatively enlightened world called Krieg, Rabute Gilliman would grow to be a wise and fair leader of his people. Other Primarchs, notably Leman Russ, would be raised initially not by his own kind, but by an all the more bestial one, a Fenrisian she-wolf. Growing up amongst a pack of predators, Leman Russ learned to hunt and survive the frigid wilds of Fenris before he ever set eyes upon a human. He would eventually find himself amongst his people, and he would grow to be a great, albeit fearsome leader. However, not all of the Emperor's sons found companionship, nor the influence of benevolent teachers. Some would only know isolation, brutality, and pain. Conrad Kurz, Primarch of the Night Lords, would fall onto the benighted world of Nostramo. His capsule would crash through the planets, crust almost all the way to its core. The infant Conrad would crawl through fire and rock to the surface of a world ridden with crime, suffering, and darkness. Conrad would witness the very worst of humanity daily, surrounded by violence, degeneracy, and misery. Conrad would learn that life was cheap on the streets of Nostramo, and that justice only came from the blade of a knife. Tormented from without and from within himself, Conrad Kurz would grow into a creature of bitterness and cruelty, a sorry reflection of what he could perhaps have been had he landed on a more civilized world. But Conrad Kurz was not alone in the tragedy of his adopted world. Of all the Emperor's sons, Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, would arguably suffer the most. Damned to a life of bloodshed and violence, and the baying of sadistic crowds, Angron would land on the world of New Syria, technologically advanced to a degree, but culturally backwards. New Syria was a civilization divided between the elite and the proletariat. The distance in social mobility between the haves and the have-nots was vast, and it was a tinderbox waiting to explode. In order to avoid civil unrest amongst the downtrodden, the elite of Nassyria, the High Riders, would hold gladiatorial games to sate the people's resentment and bloodlust. Angron would be thrown into the slave pits of the arenas, forced to compete with the oppressed for his life. Displaying his superhuman fortitude and martial prowess early, Angron would become the gladiatorial champion. Fighting, maiming, and killing merely for the jeering approval of the masses, Angron would eventually refuse to spill any further blood. Such resistance would not be tolerated by the High Riders, especially not from a slave. Angron was taken and surgically augmented with a torturous device of supreme cruelty, a mechanism that would torment the Primarch for the rest of his life, would damn his legion, and be the death knell for billions to come. The Butcher's Nails. A piece of archaeotech that drove its host to crave frenzied slaughter or else suffer agonizing pain from which the only respite was further bloodshed. Angron would be mutilated in body and mind, any trace of who he was or would be torn away and replaced with psychotic fury and violence. Angron's afflictions would be inflicted by his sons upon themselves after his reunification with them. Eager to understand their genesire's perpetual suffering, and as a display of solidarity, the World Eaters manufactured their own version of the Nails. The Legion accepted implantation almost in its entirety, and was transformed from a bellicose yet principled force into a raving host of berserkers. Desperate to please their father, the World Eaters embraced damnation. But it would not be the last time. It can be debated the role each Primarch's upbringing played in their later lives, especially when given leadership of their respective legions by the Emperor. Those who experienced camaraderie, altruism, reason, and duty would instill these principles onto their legions. For the ones who had been mistreated, abused, and regarded as little more than instruments in the schemes of others, they would in turn apply their tortured thinking onto their sons. The history of mankind has shown us, with an abundance of examples, what such generational trauma can lead to. The Primarchs, exemplifying the human condition, magnified their pain onto their legions, twisting the Astartes into broken reflections of themselves. The Night Lord's cruelty and sadism, the World Eater's psychotic aggression, the Iron Warrior's bitterness and resentment all stem from their Primarchs being damaged, both physically and psychologically. It is reasonable to assume that without the guidance of the Emperor, none of the Primarchs matured as intended. But then it could also be suggested that without the Master of Mankind's influence, the Primarchs were exposed to true empathy and sincere human interaction. The men that the Emperor intended his sons to be can only be speculated upon, but regardless, his reunion with his sons would see him deem them all worthy to command their respective legions. The Emperor is intrinsically linked to the Primarchs. They were his heralds for mankind's destiny. They were his greatest creations. But whether he truly considered them his sons, that truth is not so easy to ascertain. He permitted the Primarchs to call him father, and the Emperor indulged them by calling them sons. But above all other things, they were tools, weapons, instruments. The Emperor cared for them. He cared about them, but what was the true paternal love for his flesh and blood? Or perhaps it was the care a master swordsman pays to his blade, or a skilled artist to their brush. The Emperor needed the galaxy conquered, and mankind reunited under his banner. Whether his supreme generals did so calling him father or master mattered little. The establishment of the Imperium was all that was pivotal. This single-mindedness on the Emperor's behalf would see him fail to be as equally diligent with all of his sons. As the decades passed and the Great Crusade rolled on, each Primarch rediscovered would spend time in the Emperor's presence under his personal tutelage. The fundamentals of imperial governance, culture, and truth would be instilled by this process, but it would not be consistent in its duration for each of them. Whilst this lack of consistency would cross the coming divide drawn amongst the Primarchs, it is important to note that many of the Primarchs who knew little attention from the Emperor would eventually turn against him. And thus we come to it, the part of the tale one must lament, for it is as tragic as it seems inevitable. Pain, neglect, trauma, and torment would ripen the resentment of nearly half the Primarchs. The warp hears all, whether it is spoken word or the yearning of one's soul. And above all the Primarchs, one shone brightest of all, Horus Lupercal, the favored son and first found according to official accounts. Horus was the closest to the Emperor for almost the entire crusade, until he wasn't. With the Ulanor campaign concluded and the Orc Xenos all but decimated, the Emperor bestowed the title of War Master on Horus. He would now be first amongst equals and would command the Great Crusade in his father's name. The Emperor would return to Terra and continue his great work in secret. Though never spoken aloud to his father, Horus resented his creator's apparent abdication of his duty. Horus resented his father's secrecy, his refusal to include Horus in his further plans. Horus resented the weight of responsibility thrust upon him and the enmity of his brothers. Initially, such feelings were held in check by his sense of duty and love for his father. But as time passed, and only silence came from the Emperor on Terra, Horus began to grow increasingly conflicted in his heart. Horus' tribulation would culminate in his wounding upon the world of Davin. chosen by the dark gods and the unwitting figurehead at the center of a plot to corrupt him to their designs, Horus would have his hidden pains manipulated until he was convinced that the Emperor was seeking godhood and would dispose of Horus and his brothers with the completion of the Great Crusade. Horus Lupercal, War Master and the most favored of the Primarchs, turned on the Emperor and all those under his banner. The Horus heresy had begun. This account is already long enough without every detail of the Civil War recorded here, but what I shall comment on is this singular observation. The Horus heresy tore the nascent Imperium in half. Every last aspect of its function was forced to choose a side in the conflict. The legions, the army, the navy, the mechanicum, navigators, astropaths, even individual squads were riven with turmoil as comrade turned on comrade, brother set against brother. And at its center were the Primarchs. For what would become a galaxy-spanning civil war was at its heart a conflict amongst brothers. Rivalries and grudges that had formed and grown during the Great Crusade, some of which had been encouraged by the Emperor to inspire and motivate the Primarchs to greater feats, would erupt into outright contempt and hatred. Kurz and the Lion, Gilliman and Lorgar, Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus, Leman Russ, and Magnus the Red. All would stir titanic battles and lead to countless tragedies and deaths. But no rivalry during the heresy, besides the Lupercals and the Master of Mankind's, was so fierce as Rogel Dawn's and Perturabo's. Masters of the Imperial Fists and the Iron Warriors respectively, both Primarchs epitomized the arts of siege warfare. Rogel Dawn in defense and Perturabo in attack. No wall built by Dawn could fall. No keep set before Perturabo could resist. Dawn was an immovable fortress. Perturabo was an unstoppable juggernaut. Side by side, and in unison, they would have been invincible. Every citadel constructed would have been unassailable. Every flaw accounted for. Every blind spot covered. Any foe that came before them would have dashed themselves against their walls. They would have suffered and bled, unable to attain a single foothold. Then the hammer blow would have fallen, the masters of siegecraft marching out from their bulwark and crushing the enemy before them. Such potential in unity. The two were so alike in aspect, and yet it was not to be. Dawn would always be celebrated. Stoic, unyielding, honorable, and renowned for never telling a lie. Dawn's humors were always balanced, and this strength of will emanated from him and eased the fears of those in his presence. Dawn was respected, if not loved. Perturabo was, by comparison, cold, bitter, resentful, and cruel. More a weapon than a man, Perturabo valued data and equations above all. He exerted control over everything he surveyed, the lives of the others, inconsequential to his schemes. Perturabo was a masterful commander, but his comprehension of the human condition was utterly absent. Mortals feared the Lord of Iron, thus the Imperium feared him. Perturabo would never be looked for like Dawn. He would never be embraced like his brother was. He would never be celebrated like Dawn. And in his heart, jealousy festered until it metastasized into outright hatred. Perturabo would hate Dawn, and the heresy would permit him the opportunity to seek the Praetorians' downfall. From Phal to the walls of the Imperial Palace, the Iron Warriors would go to any lengths to bleed the Imperial fists. In turn, the Sons of Rogel Dawn would hold a singular type of hatred for the traitors, and any battle between the two legions would be especially brutal, with no side giving any quarter to their foe. This hatred would persist beyond the heresy, through the vindictive days of the Scouring, and far off into the Age of Darkness in the 41st millennium. A Primarch's love for a brother, for his sons even, could be eternal, but just as such, a Primarch's vengeful wrath for their nemesis could burn till the stars went out. The Raven, Corvus Corax himself, has hunted the Urizen, Lorgar Aurelian, for 10,000 years. From the killing fields of the Dropside Massacre to the depths of the Warp, Corax has pursued Lorgar, intent on exacting revenge for the massacre Lorgar helped perpetrate upon Corax's sons. Time is of little concern to these beings. Their motives and intentions are endless. Oh, the Primarchs. They are a contentious breed. Ever since their creation, many have remarked on their nature, pondering if anything could have been done differently to prevent the outcome that has befallen the galaxy. Yes, my stranded friends, the very galaxy you have been separated from is the roiling maelstrom of conflict because of the Emperor's sons. Perhaps not the Orcs or the Necrons, or even the Aldari, but the rest of it is all their fault. For all their gifts and abilities, none have put aside their pride in a bid to undo the damage their actions have caused. Had Lorgar obeyed his father's decree, had Magnus shown restraint, had Russ looked beyond his prejudice, had Dawn raised Perturabo up to stand by his side, maybe none of what transpired would have. Or perhaps it was fated. No matter what any had tried to do. The pettiness, the rivalries, the grudges, the hatred, it all bled into the Primarchs' legions, and then down into the chapters. The Primarchs' sons have continued their fathers' legacies, launching campaigns and crusades in their sires' names. The same resentment fueling their wrath 10,000 years later. The galaxy has burned for 100 centuries due to grievances few, if any, were actually alive to witness. It is to our great misfortune that we inherit the stars damned by beings no longer present to see it. The loyal sons of the Emperor are gone, perhaps to one day return to set right that which they caused. The Wolf King, the Avenging Sun, the War Hawk. These heroes of the Imperium have become legend and myth. The truth of their lives lost, for none now live who remember them. Even their sons, separated from their genetic forebears by 10,000 years, only know the sanitized accounts of their fathers. The great tragedy of our time is that we must endure the traitor Primarchs and their bastard sons. Creatures of the warp. They have manifested on a number of occasions across the galaxy, their appearances heralding destruction, disease, madness, and death. The Imperium has been devastated each time the traitor Primarchs, now demons, have descended upon it. Having sworn themselves to the Chaos Gods, the turncoat sons of the Emperor are now slaves to darkness. Elevated in power, no doubt, but shackled by wills not of their own. The demon Primarchs are all capricious, bitter, rage-fueled beings. Their attention split between the Dark God's great game and seeking revenge against the Imperium. Maybe that has been our only respite from total destruction at their hands. The traitor Primarchs' vengeful natures are turned against one another as much as they are against the Emperor's servants. Alas, we must weather the sins of those made to rise us up so long ago. Beacons of unity, heralds of a noble bright future, intended to shine their light and chase away the darkness left by old night. Instead, we bear the weight of their petulance, their ego, their self-interest, and their callous disregard for those they were meant to protect. The Emperor's dream has failed. It died when Horus chose treachery, but its death sentence was signed when the Master of Mankind envisioned the creation of his sons. His intention was no doubt to design paragons of humanity, aspects of himself personified in flesh and majesty, to govern and guide and lead mankind at his side. But what was never considered was the fallibility of human nature. The Primarchs were humanity concentrated. For all their power, charisma, and grace, they were still susceptible to jealousy, pettiness, and arrogance. The Primarchs were destined to fail because at their core, they were fundamentally humans, garbed in the bodies of demigods. True power influenced by man's fatal flaws. 18 catastrophes awaiting the match that would light their fuse. Now the Imperium fights to survive their failure. The echoes of their actions reverberating through the ages. Mankind teeters on the precipice of extinction. The time is a minute to midnight, and when we need them most, our greatest heroes, our immortals, are absent, their place upon the walls empty. We must face the threats alone, brace against the horrors coming for us all. Or, should I more accurately say, the horrors coming for you. Trust in the strength of mankind, my friends. Trust in man's will to endure. Do not look for bygone heroes, for they are all as good as dead. In the grim darkness of the far future, hope died the day mankind's saviors fell to earth.